White initiates with a solid central pawn push, establishing a balanced and dynamic game with a slight initial edge. Black mirrors White's solid start, maintaining the dynamic equilibrium and demonstrating accurate positional understanding. White expands control in the center with a pawn thrust, keeping the position fluid and dynamically balanced. The move the pawn to e5 by Black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to e6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to c3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to b4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to f3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to c5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the advanced pawn, solidifying control and maintaining the slight advantage gained. Black redirects a knight to a more active square, maintaining pressure and a solid position despite White's slight advantage. The move the knight to f3 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the knight takes on e5 executes a favorable trade, which enables the pawn to f4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight on the e-file to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to c3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to c5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black counters with knight development, reinforcing the center and maintaining a solid defensive structure. White develops the bishop to an active diagonal, applying pressure and maintaining the slight advantage. Black offers a bishop check, forcing White to adjust and maintaining dynamic balance in the position. White develops the knight to a flexible square, supporting potential pawn advances and maintaining dynamic balance. Black centralizes the queen, connecting the rooks and preparing for castling while keeping the position solid. White advances a central pawn, supporting its structure and maintaining dynamic balance. Black recaptures a central pawn with a knight, maintaining piece activity and the dynamic balance. White recaptures with a knight, centralizing the piece and maintaining the slight positional edge. Black recaptures with a knight, centralizing the piece and continuing the solid positional play. White develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, improving its scope and maintaining the slight advantage. Black castles kingside, securing the king and preparing for future central action. White castles kingside, mirroring Black's move and ensuring king's safety. Black exchanges bishops, simplifying the position slightly and maintaining solid control. White recaptures with the queen, centralizing it and maintaining pressure on Black's position. Black reinforces the center with a pawn push, solidifying its structure. White initiates flank expansion with a pawn push, aiming to create dynamic play. Black contests the flank with a pawn push, preventing White's expansion and maintaining equality. White solidifies its flank pawn structure, maintaining control of the expanded territory. Black repositions a rook to the central file, increasing its activity and pressure. White centralizes the queen, coordinating pieces and maintaining pressure. The move the pawn to f6 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to g4, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the pawn to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to e6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to c5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. unlocking the pawn to h5 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on e5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White places a rook on the open file, establishing strong control and pressure. Black develops the bishop to an active square, improving its placement and maintaining solid play. White reinforces the center and prepares for pawn advances, maintaining positional stability. Black captures a flank pawn, creating an open file and potentially dynamic play. White recaptures on the flank, opening files and maintaining a balanced position. Black supports its central pawns, solidifying the structure and preparing for further action. White pushes a central pawn, aiming to break open lines and gain dynamic initiative. Black repositions the bishop to a better diagonal, improving its influence and maintaining equilibrium. White exchanges rooks on the open file, simplifying and maintaining positional control. Black recaptures with the rook, maintaining activity on the open file. White advances a pawn to control more central space, maintaining the status quo. Black recaptures a central pawn, opening lines and seeking activity. White recaptures, opening lines and maintaining a solid pawn structure. Black develops the bishop to a passive square, reinforcing the pawn chain. White exchanges pawns on the central file, simplifying the structure. Black recaptures, maintaining a compact pawn formation. White centralizes the queen, increasing its influence and coordinating pieces. Black prepares pawn expansion on the kingside, aiming for counterplay. White activates a rook on the open central file, increasing pressure. Black repositions the rook, doubling on the open file for enhanced pressure. White repositions the queen to a more active square, improving coordination. Black repositions the rook to a more active square, increasing its scope. White repositions the queen, seeking better squares and maintaining pressure. The move the king to h7 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to d8, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the queen to b5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the queen to c7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the king to h1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the bishop to c4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to b2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the bishop to an active diagonal, improving piece coordination. The move the queen to e6 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to b7, activating the rook on an open file. Afterwards, the queen takes on d6, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on d6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the rook takes on d6, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the rook to b2 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on e5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White advances a pawn, opening lines and creating dynamic potential for white. The move the queen to b3 by Black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to c4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Paving the way for the bishop to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the rook to c7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the pawn to h3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the pawn to f5 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the e-file takes on f5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White exchanges queens, simplifying into a favorable endgame with a clear advantage. Black recaptures with the bishop, maintaining piece activity in the simplified position. White captures a central pawn, opening lines and solidifying the advantage. Black exchanges a bishop for white's rook, simplifying while maintaining the pawn advantage. White advances a pawn, strengthening its central control and maintaining the advantage. Black repositions the rook, improving its defensive capabilities and maintaining structure. White captures black's rook, eliminating a key defender and solidifying the overwhelming advantage. Black recaptures with the rook, maintaining activity on the open file. White activates the bishop to a strong attacking diagonal, increasing pressure. Black repositions the rook, seeking active squares and maintaining material balance. White captures a pawn, creating a passed pawn and increasing the material advantage. Black supports its king and pawn structure, aiming to consolidate. White repositions the bishop to a more active square, increasing its influence. Black repositions the king to safety, consolidating its defensive position. White repositions the king, improving its safety and centralizing. Black repositions the rook, defending key squares and maintaining structural integrity. The move the pawn to e5 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to c5, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Allowing the rook to d2 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety. Which enables the king to e3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the rook to a2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the bishop to e7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black captures the advanced pawn, challenging white's structure and maintaining balance. White recaptures with the bishop, improving piece activity and maintaining the advantage. Black repositions the king, improving its safety in the endgame. White centralizes the king, activating it for the endgame and maintaining pressure. Black repositions the rook, defending key squares and maintaining positional integrity. White brings the king closer to the center, actively participating in the endgame. Black checks with the rook, forcing white's king to move and disrupting its centralization. White moves the king to safety, maintaining its active position and the advantage. Black repositions the rook, creating threats and maintaining its active presence. White repositions the bishop, controlling key squares and maintaining the positional edge. Black maneuvers the rook, seeking better squares and maintaining pressure. White centralizes the king, actively participating in the endgame and maintaining pressure. Black repositions the rook, threatening penetration and maintaining dynamic play. White repositions the bishop, reinforcing control and maintaining the positional advantage. Black repositions the rook, challenging white's control and maintaining active play. White repositions the bishop, improving its position and maintaining pressure. Black repositions the rook, seeking active squares and maintaining pressure. White repositions the bishop, reinforcing control and maintaining the advantage. Black repositions the rook, challenging white's control and maintaining active play. White repositions the bishop, improving its scope and maintaining pressure. Black repositions the rook, seeking active squares and maintaining pressure. White repositions the bishop, reinforcing control and maintaining the advantage. Black repositions the king, improving its safety and consolidating its position. White centralizes the king, actively participating in the endgame and maintaining pressure. Black repositions the rook, challenging white's control and maintaining active play. White repositions the bishop, improving its scope and maintaining pressure. Black repositions the rook, seeking active squares and maintaining pressure. White repositions the bishop to a passive square, which slightly reduces its activity. The move the king to h7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to h5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to d7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to a6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to b5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to a2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to c6, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the king to e7 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to d7, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the king to g7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to a4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to a6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to d1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to h5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the rook, defending key squares and maintaining structural integrity. White advances a pawn, creating space and potentially a passed pawn. Black repositions the rook, maintaining its active presence on the file. White repositions the bishop, improving its control over key squares. The move the rook to f1 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook to e2, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to h4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to g7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to c7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to e3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to b6, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the bishop, solidifying its control and exploiting black's positional weakness. Black repositions the rook, attempting to defend but unable to overcome the disadvantage. The move the bishop to f6 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to h3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to h5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to g5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to e2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to f6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to e4, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the rook, seeking active squares and maintaining pressure. White centralizes the king, improving its position and maintaining the advantage. Black repositions the rook, seeking active squares and maintaining pressure. The move the bishop to e5 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to h3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to h5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to g5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to b4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to d5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to h4, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black checks with the rook, forcing white's king to move and maintaining activity. White moves the king to safety, maintaining its active position and the advantage. Black repositions the rook, seeking active squares and maintaining pressure. White advances a pawn, preparing to expand on the kingside and maintain pressure. The move the rook to b6 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to a3, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the bishop to d6, significantly boosting piece coordination. Next comes the rook to f3 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit, whereby the king to e7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to e3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to b4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White moves the king to safety, consolidating the overwhelming winning advantage. The move the rook to b5 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to h5, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the pawn on the g-file takes on h5, executes a favorable trade. Next comes the rook to b7 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit, whereby the king to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the pawn on the g-file takes on h5, executes a favorable trade. Next comes the bishop to f5 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. White advances a pawn, securing the position and maintaining the overwhelming winning advantage.